we have this feeling as the public that doctors are somehow these gods, these angelic, without fault people, that everything they say and do must be the right thing, when in fact they're human, they're fallible, and they're wrapped up in entire establishment and industry that is based on writing papers that are for studies that are funded by pharmaceutical industries. And like there's a lot of vested interest, even if it's not an intentional decision by them, there is a vested interest to kind of go along to get along, and do things they wouldn't normally be the logical things to do. Is that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And there are so many forces really conspiring against doctors through their training to really be equipped to, think for themselves. And, this was all established 100 years ago through the efforts of Rockefeller and the Flexner Report. But what happens during your medical education is that they inundate you with so much information, and they really want you to memorize and regurgitate this information. So I remember early on in medical school thinking this is so different from my undergrad because, we both went to MIT, and MIT, their goal is to create scientists. So they want you to be able to think. So when I took, biochemistry and cell biology and human physiology there, the exams were open book because you weren't going to find the answers there, right? The answers required you to think and solve problems. But there's no need to memorize reference information because that's going to change over time anyway. So you can use the book as a sort of resource, just like you might use a dictionary if you come across a word that you don't know what it means to refresh your memory. In medical school, by contrast, when I studied molecular biology there, on the exam, questions wanted you to regurgitate the name of an enzyme. And that's just really superfluous to your understanding. It's completely unnecessary to memorize the enzyme name. What's important is to understand the mechanism of the chemical reaction and what are the factors involved so that you know how someone's physiology might change based on changing conditions. And that's not what was emphasized at all. And I think the purpose of flooding you with so much information to memorize is that you don't have time to really think about what you're learning and question it. So one example that's particularly relevant to this situation has to do with what's known as Koch's postulates. So when I studied molecular microbiology in medical school, they introduced this set of rules called Koch's postulates, named after Robert Koch, a famous microbiologist and physician from a century ago, who they actually have the CDC equivalent in Germany is named after him. It's called the Robert Koch Institute. And he came up with a set of 4 common sense rules of how you prove that a specific microorganism is responsible for causing a disease. And so they emphasized the importance of that, but then they didn't go on to present the experimental evidence for disease X, Y, or Z on how those postulates were demonstrated. They just sort of expected us to assume that they had been, and they went right into learning about the specific organisms and the specific diseases they were alleged to cause. So when you go through this type of an education system where you have to just regurgitate information without really thinking about it, then you continue that pattern. And when you start to practice, they've structured the reimbursement system basically to require you to see as many patients as possible in as short a time as possible, because each patient encounter is reimbursed at a pretty low rate. So since you have all these loans to pay back, and then you have the overhead of having your practice, the building, the x-ray machine, paying nurses and a receptionist, and all of those things, that you basically have to just keep all day long seeing patients. And sometimes they only spend 6 minutes with a patient. So that's really just not enough time to think about things very carefully. You have to just come up with a quick response, usually write a prescription,
Yeah.
and then move on to the next patient.